Okay, welcome back everybody. Today we are going to discuss the first part of Chapter 8, which is sonata form. So we're going to learn the basics today and then talk about the nitty-gritties of it next week, the really specific stuff. So there are three things that you have to know about sonata form, and this is the most basic thing. It's the three components, all right? So there is the exposition, the development, and the recap or recapitulation. Recap for short. Everybody calls it the recap. All right? Those are the three parts of the sonata form, and that's really what it comes down to. And again, form, we're discussing, just like we talked about theme and variations last week, we'll be talking about rondo later in the semester, next semester. So these are just forms, just like ternary form, binary form, all of these forms. Sonata form is a form that developed in the classical era with people like Mozart and Haydn, and it's still being used today. I mean, it became so popular that this three-part form, that it's, yeah. And you could say it's kind of a twist on ternary form. It has a lot of similarities, and it kind of comes out of ternary form a little bit. But we'll get to that in a second. So, sonata form, it's generally a pretty large structure. It's longer and is usually found in like the first movement or the last movement of a major work like a symphony or a piano sonata or a concerto, something like that. But it's usually it's in the first movement, and then sometimes you also get it in the final movement. And it pops up in other stuff too. So, yep, but it's an important one because it's everywhere. So the one thing that can be confusing is we're discussing the form and not the type of piece. So the difference between sonata form and a sonata, those are two totally separate things. Well, they're not totally separate, but think of them as different things. So a sonata is something that's performed. Usually it's a small group of musicians. So you'll either have just piano solo, so a piano sonata would just be piano playing a piece of music that's written only for piano. And it's usually multi-movement work. A violin sonata would usually be like a violin and piano playing together, and it would be a multi-movement work. A trio sonata, same thing. So you've got actually technically 4 instruments, but you would have a small ensemble, and then they play this piece of music that, is a multi-movement work. So that's a sonata, as in the, it would be like calling something a symphony or a ballet or an opera. It sort of designates what kind of instruments are playing it and that it's got lots of movements to it, right? So the form is specific to one movement, all right? Now, when I say they have nothing to do with each other, I will say that sonatas, usually 99.999% of the time, their first movement and their last movement is in sonata form, all right? So this is sonata form. And we are going to be discussing the form, sonata form. We are going to be discussing the form, not the kind of piece, okay? So, yeah. So just keep that in mind. They're two separate things. So put your form hat on and we'll talk. So, basically, the exposition introduces the main themes of the piece, right? It's the introduction. You could call it the introduction. We call it the exposition. And it's going to have the first theme. There's usually a little transition to another theme. Sometimes you'll have a third theme, and then sometimes you'll get a little codetta at the end to wrap it up. but it'll end on some sort of cadence, usually perfect authentic. And then what happens is it moves to the development. Now this is the second section of the piece. The development, there's no standard design, all right? So usually you'll hear these themes come back, but they'll be changed and they'll be modulated, or they'll be thrown in a different key. The composer it's basically a free-for-all. The composer can throw in new themes, he can take the old themes and mash them together, or switch them up, or put theme 1, as the first part, and then theme 2 is the second part. I mean, he can do anything he wants. You'll see changes of key, you'll see changes of meter, you'll see, brand new themes being introduced. Composer can do anything he wants, all right? So that's the development. Basically, generally what happens though, is even though it's an anything goes situation, what's typical is that the composer will take the first themes, theme 1 and 2, and he will develop these themes. So theme 1 and 2 get developed. So the composer expands on them, makes them bigger, he changes the key, he messes with them, all right? So he messes around with the themes, and they call that developing the theme. And then the last part of the piece is the recapitulation. And this just means that basically the exposition comes back for the most part. So theme 1 and 2 come back in the original form. Okay? And then usually you'll get, and then at the very end, to wrap the whole piece up, you'll have a coda, which is kind of like a little mini recap of all the stuff that went on to end the piece, okay? So original, come back, so theme 1 and 2 comes back, basically the exposition comes back, and then he slaps a coda on the end to make it really super done. And that's all it is. So it's hopefully pretty, makes a little bit of sense. So yeah, we're going to discuss in this one Haydn Sonata in G major. And I will post a video of somebody else playing it because you don't want to hear me play Haydn. I will butcher it. But let's talk about the exposition. So in this case, and I'm going to switch over to the projector so that you guys can actually see the music when we're talking, and we'll talk more in a sec. All right, everybody. So let's take a look at this first exposition. We're just going to go sort of section by section. So we're looking at the first movement, which is where you commonly see sonata form, and Haydn Sonata in G major. So this is the best definition of the exposition. The exposition states the material on which the entire movement is based. All right? So it basically gives you the themes, the motives, the melodies that the movement's going to be based on. You could think of it as an introduction. They call it an exposition. They always have. I don't know why. So if we look at figure 8.1, we get the first theme of the sonata. So you get ba-da-da-da-dum, bum-bum-bum-bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Right? So this is our first little theme. Right? So it's in G major. And you get it in the first 12 measures. All right? So the purpose of the first theme is to provide stability and a frame of reference for the following sections. In the Haydn Sonata, the tonic key is emphasized by tonic progressions and dominant tonic repetitions that gives way to modulation of cadence. So you can see it's in G, then it goes to C, and up to D, so 1, 4, 5, 1, lots of tonic-dominant relationships, 4, 5, 1, right? Then we get to D major, it modulates to the dominant, right? Which is pretty common, that the first theme is going to modulate into the dominant, and the second theme will be in the dominant. All right? So here's our whole first theme. Then this is the beginning of the transition, all right? So once we do that, we have a little bit of a transition. See this? So once we modulate, and that first theme is introduced, we have a little bit of a transition, all right? So the transition creates a smooth connection between the first and second themes, all right? So that's all it does. It's like a little bridge that connects the first theme to the second theme, all right? Although a transition can include the modulation of the tonic key at the end of the first theme, transitions contain only first theme material, all right? So you're not going to get any new material in this transition. Or it will include only second theme material, combinations of those materials, or material unrelated to either theme. All right? So it actually could be anything. So you can get a bunch of different materials in the transition. And then we transition right into, here's our transition. So you can see it's not related to anything that we had previously, right? So here's our previous theme, right? So this is actually all new material, totally different, right? Except for this. Right, so here's our little transition, non-functional harmony, and it moves us to the second theme of the sonata. Right? Now the second theme generally tends to be more lyrical than the first theme. And it usually also contrasts with the first theme. This is the other thing. So it tends to be more lyrical, but the most important thing is it's going to be a contrast to the first theme, which, you know, gives the composer more to work with when he gets to the development. Right? In movements and minor keys, the second theme is often in the relative major. So in minor keys, the second theme is often in the relative major. And in some early sonatas, the second theme is a restatement of the first theme. So if you're looking at a really early classical sonata, you may just see one theme. And then the second theme is going to just be a restatement of the first theme in a dominant key. All right? That's the key, though, the dominant key. Alright? These sonata form movements with only one theme are known as monothematic. Now you're not going to run into that much. So worry more about just understanding that you're going to get a first theme, and then there's a little transition, and then the second theme is going to be in contrast to that first theme.